Welcome to the Texas Grass Gathering. This is meant to be a grass party celebrating plants. I'm really glad that you can join us today. This event is hosted by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I'm Megan Clayton. I'm an Extension Range Specialist based in the Corpus Christi Research and Extension Center and with the new Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management at Texas A&M. In addition to Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, our main sponsor is the Bennett Trust, whose mission is stewardship in the Edwards Plateau. I'd like to thank Extension, especially District 11, Bennett Trust, Corteva Agri-Science, Bayer Crop Science, Bamert Seed Company, and Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute for donating these neat prizes. Many thanks also to Annette Kayard from the Corpus Christi Extension Center for her help in developing, advertising, and hosting this fun party all about grasses. Thanks to Dr. Suzanne Walsh, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, for monitoring the chat box, and to Dr. Maureen Frank, our Extension Wildlife Specialist, for bravely helping with technology. Our first presenter likely needs no introduction. Dr. Baron Rector has worked for the Extension Service in College Station for over 40 years. He is mine and probably about 2 million other people's go-to man for plant identification. His skills are truly incredible, but even more incredible is his gift and passion for teaching landowners and our youth about rangeland management, including plant ID. I don't know how many 4-H kids he's influenced throughout the past decades, myself and my brother included, but these youth and now adults are scattered throughout the state and nation carrying a piece of Dr. Rector's passion for our wild places. Today, he's going to talk about what the heck we're supposed to be looking for to correctly identify a grass.
Very good. My name is Baron Rector, and I would like for you to know that today, many of the things that I'm going to be using come out of the Field Guide to Common Texas Grasses that Steve Hatch, Kelly Humphreys, and Janae are doing put together. So it is important that we understand the parts of a grass because it reflects on what we are going to see. And through our training, what do we see when we look out at a field of grass or an individual grass? So I want to spend time on grass parts and what to look for identification. As you know, across the world, the grass family is about the 5th largest family, and in North America, 373 grasses. In Texas, over 600 species plus that have been identified. So when I go out in the field, and the top picture is of grass in Cranfield's Gap and a close-up of the seed head. The bottom left and the bottom right are both the same grass, but on the Link Ranch in Stevens County. So when I look at these, and every day the plants are changing, they're either growing or going dormant, or they're germinating. What do I look for? How do I see that? And most commonly, the people that we have gone out in the field with who tell us the name of a grass or any plant, that is what we're going to be learning from. And even more importantly, what to look at and what to see at a time of year. So many times in the 4-H program, young people beginning in grass identification, in our publications, they're going to see this figure, which labels a lot of part of the plants. Well, that seems to be confusing to many because sometimes they learn how to identify the grass because somebody penciled in an X on the bottom of the practice mount, and they learn that X rather than the parts. So when I look at these individual plant parts that are in this drawing, am I going to be looking at it as a taxonomist would, one that uses the science of naming to get to the correct name of the plant? Or am I the person that's in the field and I'm going to be using observational identification skills? So I look at the plant parts. We are taught to look at leaves and the stems, the flower, the roots, the fruit, and the seed. But these characteristics are highly variable. They can be changed. As my English teacher in the 8th grade said, I after E except after C. And what she was saying is there is always an exception to everything. So in Texas, where we're more frequently in a drought than in above normal rainfall, the height of plants is affected, and yet there's a range there. And the rainfall pattern, our temperature patterns, our soil types, if the plant had been in a grazing situation, if it had recently recovered and was growing after a fire, or if that plant is out in a vacant lot. What is it going to look like? And so understand that across every plant part that we will look at, there is a range in size and a range and color, and then in the plant itself, there's a range in height. When we get into some of the earlier books, uh, a lot of time is spent on the parts of a complete spikelet. So, as people learning how to identify grass, like in any science, we're going to have to learn a new terminology. And as I go across the 154 families of plants in Texas, each family has a different set of terminology, and it's no different for the grasses in the Poaceae that these individual plant parts have names that maybe we've never heard of, and for some of us, we might not hear about them again. But look over at the far left of this image for the blue stems. It says it has paired spikelets. And so as I go through, I find out that some plants have male and female plants, that all the parts of a flower are not always together in one unit. And then when I look at that unit, it has very small parts, so that as the practitioner, did I take my magnifying glass with me into the field to look for some of these parts that may or may not, you may not be able to see them with the naked eye. Or when I'm in the lab and I'm looking at a plant, I might be using 10 to 30x macroscope to get down to the finer points. But most people, we're identifying these plants in the field. They're handed to us by a rancher, by a master naturalist. And the question always is, what is this? So when a grass first comes up, and the drawing here is a seedling just past the seedling grass stage, but notice the third from the bottom is the actual caryopsis or the seed that upon germination, it put down a primary seminal root, and then it has transitionary nodes for other roots to come off of that. And as I go up, I get up to the ground level past a series of roots, and I hit what I'm going to call in the monocotyledons, I'm going to have a coleoptile, the very beginning of the photosynthetic material of a seed that has imbibed water and has now gone through the process of germination. And then I'm going to have a first leaf, a second leaf, and notice that that third leaf, because I cannot see the base of the leaf and it's coming out of the sheath, out of those leaves that I'm looking at, that is the one leaf that is going to continue to elongate as this plant grows. So when I begin at the base of the plant and I'm looking at a grass, unlike our forbs, legumes, and woody plants that basically have a taproot, when we look at grasses, they have a fibrous root system. And some of the grasses have produced adventitious roots at various nodes to help stabilize the plant if it has a weak stem and to keep it upright and heading toward the sun. And as you see in the writing, there's very uh, interesting things for plants in the plant world to have produced adventitious roots. We don't only see that in the grass family. So, being on rangeland, the plant on the left is a taproot of a perennial shrub, but we have the fibrous root system that's going to be found on our short grasses or shallow rooted, our mid bunch grasses, and as we go up, the deepest rooted grasses with the fibrous root system are going to be our tall bunch grasses that we have. Now, along with the root system of a fibrous root, we have other reproductive asexual organs that can help give rise to new plants or to a part of the plant. And as you look in this drawing, the thing that we're looking at underground is called the rhizome, a horizontal underground stem which consists of roots, nodes, internodes, and often leafy bracts, as we might see in beak panicum. And so the other reproductive part that is a stem is the stolon, and it lays horizontal on the ground most of the time, but it also consists of roots, nodes, internodes, and often again leafy bracts. But look at the examples of our common stoloniferous grasses that are native to Texas, like vine mesquite, which can have a stolon up to about 35 feet long, or I get down to our sod grasses, buffalo grass and common curly mesquite, which have stolons, but they're shorter. And there's a key characteristic at the node of one of those grasses having a tuft of hair and the other one being glabrous. And that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at when I do not have a flower head. Isn't it amazing that most of the books that are sold in America to aid us in plant identification are wildflower picture books and weed books where the plant is already in flower, and a lot of times you can't see the leaf, you can't see the stem, but the people who write those books know that beauty sells, and that for you to see the entire plant so it would be useful for you in identifying it, that might be of lesser value. So we have the stems, the culms. So look at the jointed uh, culm here that begins at the ground level and goes up to the top of the inflorescence. Then we have the leaf structure, and across the grasses, as seen on the right, most grasses have parallel veins, but the entire leaf is actually the sheath and the leaf combined when I get in there, and then I have the stem supporting that. So when I get to looking at the leaf, there are different characters that help me in the field occasionally, but more with my magnifying glass. And one of these is called the ligule, and it's a narrow strap straight shaped structure in most grasses that you see, but it can be membranous, it can be hairy, it can be a membrane and hair combined, or it can be totally absent. So you look at the bottom left picture and you can see the hair there of a hairy ligule, or the one in the bottom middle of a membrane, and then one of a combined membrane. So associated with the ligule is the auricle, an area of the outer or abaxial side of the leaf where the blade and the sheath join. It is generally much lighter in color, varies in size and shape from species. It can be purple, it can be black in that area. But notice that that whole area with the ligule and the auricle, that whole area is called the collar region that is in between the sheath and the blade. So the auricle, many times the auricle, as we see in these drawings, I can have one that is slender. It can be a point. It can be claw-like, uh, or it can be absent. And so this characteristic is very valuable in separating out the genera, even in the blue stems that we are talking about today. Another characteristic is the phytomer. Range people learn about this, that I have an upper node and then I have a leaf and an inner node and a bud, and I go down to the lower node. Well, some grasses at those nodes, they're going to have hair, or the hair will be absent, and often that can be helpful to me in identifying a grass. So when I get into the grass flower, unlike my training with the dicots, I'm not looking at petals. I'm going to be looking at a different group of plant names, and the flower is actually in the grass family called the spikelet. And so here are examples of spikelets on this image. So when I get into the spikelet, I'm going to be looking at the drawing right out of the Guide to Texas Common Grasses, and look at the base. I'm going to be looking at the pedestal, and so some of these, they can not have a pedestal, but they can be attached to the stem, or the axis of the inflorescence without a pedicel, and these would be sessile. So as I look at this, in the bottom right picture of the two picture drawings, I see a sessile spikelet, but then above it I have a pedicellate spikelet, which these can be combined. So the spikelet, it is composed of glooms, racilla, and florets, as you see in this drawing. And so usually I have two glooms, and they're at the very base, and I have a first gloom and a second gloom. Some grasses may only have one, some may have none, but they're attached to the pedicel. And so uh, when I look at these, oftentimes the glooms are going to have vein marks. They're going to have darker veins, lighter veins, or the veins may be absent, but they help me delimit the size of the spikelet. So here, the lower gloom is called the first gloom. The one above it is called the second gloom. So all what you see in the picture makes up the spikelet. So when I look at the middle of the spikelet, what am I looking at? I'm looking at the racilla. And then I'm looking at the actual florets, which more resemble in the dicots what a flower looks like. And the picture on the left, the red is showing you all the different florets, but it's pointing at the lemma. So I have a lemma, a floral axis, and a palea. Now the lemma is up in the floret itself, and the bottom one, the longer one, is usually the lemma, and the one above it is going to be the palea and the palea. So this whole thing is our flower or the spikelet in the grass family. Some can have awns, and the awns can originate from the glooms, the lemmas, or the palea. And then in the grass flower itself, I usually have three stamen. I have a pistil and loticules. I usually have two, but sometimes three. So I'm looking at the ovary, down at the base of this flower with the stigma above and the anthers with the filaments on the sides, and down at the loticule, that is more resembles what a petal of a dicot flower looks like. So the last thing I want to cover is the arrangement of these, and in that arrangement we can have a spicate raceme, and a raceme or an open panicle. And understanding here that I'm above the most upper leaf, this arrangement of the spikelets coming off the central axis helps me in my keying to understand what grass I have. So understanding the flower arrangement and where the florets sit, how the spikelet is attached to the racilla, that is very important on that central axis. And Megan, those are the basic parts of a grass that I think are important that lead to identification of a grass. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rector. That was amazing information that you crammed into a very short period of time. Our second presentation today is from the guy who got stuck being my mentor, my previous boss man, my colleague, and my friend, Dr. Bob Lyons. Dr. Lyons has been with the Extension Service for well over 30 years. Most recently, he was stationed at the Uvalde Research and Extension Center as an extension range specialist. He's good at keying grasses out, and since I am not, I asked that he discuss how we could potentially stand in a field and at least put grasses into their genera. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us today, Dr. Lyons.
Okay, so why do we want to start with the genera? The ultimate objective is to ID the species, as Dr. Rector said, but we've got, according to Shaw, 723 grass species in Texas, 181 genera, and so within a county or a limited geographic area, we're going to have a limited number of major genera and species. So if we work from the genera, we can get to the species much quicker. So basically what we'd like to do is we'd like to site ID to genera and then maybe use some of these other skills to get to the species. So this is going to require an understanding of the anatomical terms that Dr. Rector mentioned, and it's also going to require some practice to get, proficient with the skills. So just to kind of put things in perspective, these are the 6 genera in Texas that have the most number of species, but these species only account for about 25 to 26% of the total species in the state. That's just kind of put things in perspective. Dr. Rector mentioned this book, and I highly recommend it. It's a field guide to common Texas grasses. It's available at the Texas A&M University Press, and it's divided into genera. And for each genera, there's a brief description of plant parts that define that genera. And then this is a more exhaustive book. This is Guide to Texas Grasses by Shaw. This was published, I think, in 2012, and Hatch's book was in 2015. This has over 1,000 pages, 668 species are keyed with illustrations, some with short descriptions, all of them, and then some with photographs. So I highly recommend both of these books. If you want to just get started out, start with the Hatch book, and then the Shaw book has some excellent illustrations in it, as well as does the Hatch book, but even more in this book. Another tool that you're going to need is a hand lens or a magnifying glass. I like this kind because it's got a 3/4 inch window. It's about a 16x power, fits in your pocket, so it makes it really convenient. But you're going to need something like this to look at some of these smaller plant parts, even to site ID maybe, or make sure that you've got the right genera. Okay, so in Hatch's book, this is just an example. He doesn't present these in tables like this, but he presents each genera with descriptions of characteristics. And what I've done here is I've highlighted some of the characteristics that might separate these 3 bluestem genera. And you'll notice that for culms, the andropogon can have solid culms that are branched. And then a key characteristic for the Bothrocloa are that they have numerous panicle branches, or ramies, that are ascending. In other words, pushing or standing up. So those are a couple of characteristics that we can use to separate some of these genera. And then most of these native Bothrocloa have an aromatic smell when they're crushed. So if we look at these 3 photographs or line drawings of these 3 genera, just representative of the genera, one thing that we can notice is over here with the andropogon on the left, big blue stem, for example, you notice that the culms branch, that they actually branch. Then you'll notice with the Bothrocloa that they don't branch. The culm doesn't branch. It branches here at the top with the panicle. And this is what we mean by ascending. And so in that panicle there, you see numerous panicle branches that are ascending. Okay, so if we looked at these 3 specimens right here, we could pretty easily say, I think that's the one in the middle is a Bothrocloa because of the way that panicle arrangement is. And then over on the right is the Schizocarium with a little blue stem. And the culm doesn't branch, but you have floret branches or flowering branches off the main culm. Okay, so we could use that ascending characteristic to separate or get an idea, or at least kind of try to pinpoint the Bothrocloa. But here's a little wrinkle that nature throws at us. Here's a Bothrocloa on the left, King Ranch bluestem, and a Dichanthium, Kleberg, on the right, and both of those have ascending panicles. The raceme in there are ascending. So how do we tell these 2 apart? So this is where you're going to need your hand lens or magnifying glass. And if we look at the spikelets, you'll see that the tip of the spikelets are pointed with the Bothrocloa, and with the Dicanthemum, they're more rounded. And so that's a pretty good characteristic to separate those two genera. Okay, so then we get into some other genera that are similar, and you'll see that most of these characteristics I've got in black, and the one I've got highlighted is the spikelets are subtended by one to several bristles. So that's a characteristic that separates panicums from soteria, which is a bristlegrass. So we're going to take a look and see what that looks like here. On the left, we got a line drawing of vine mesquite, which is a panicum, and you'll see that there's the spikelet here, and there's no bristle below the spikelet. But then if we look at the bristlegrass, right below that spikelet, there is a bristle. And on some of these bristle grasses, like this one here, that's plains bristlegrass, you'll have those bristles all up and down that panicle. But there's one that it's called river-shown bristlegrass, and for years it was called river-shown panicum. And what they discovered eventually was that at the top of the panicum, or panicle, I'm sorry, the panicle, there was that floret or spikelet was subtended by a bristle. And so that's what separated that particular species out into a bristlegrass. So characteristics like this can get you in the right genera. And then from there, you can try to go to the species. Okay, so love grasses and tridents, the irrigrossis or love grasses, the tridents, these are a little bit difficult to separate. And again, there's only one characteristic here that's really, that in my opinion, really helps separate these two genera. If we look at the lemmas, and again, this is where you're going to need your hand lens or a magnifying glass. There's short hairs on the bottom part of the lemma, and I'll show you what that looks like here in the next slide. So on the left, we've got plains lovegrass, and on the right, we've got pink tridents. And you'll notice that the florets overlap each other, almost kind of like sergeant stripes almost, on both of these two grasses. In fact, there's a red lovegrass that looks very similar to this pink tridents. So the way to separate these two is we look at the lemma, and here's the lemma right here, and right down here in that circle, that's where those hairs are at the base of the lemma. And that's a very definitive characteristic to separate these grasses, these two genera. One thing I might point out is that in both of these books, in Hatch's book and Shaw's book, there's a map for each grass. So that kind of gives us an idea if you're trying to go down to species, maybe that grass hasn't been reported in your area, so it might not be the grass that you're looking for. It doesn't mean it's not in your area, but it just hasn't been reported. Okay, and then the muleys and the drop seeds, Muhlenbergia and the Sporobolus, there's a couple of characteristics that can separate these two genera. One is that the Muhlenbergia, the lemmas are going to have 3 nerves, and they're usually on. And then the Sporobolus or the drop seeds, they have one vein or one nerve in that lemma, and they're not on. And then the other characteristic that we use is that very often you'll have that panicle will be enclosed or partially enclosed in the sheath of the leaf right below that panicle. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a second. Okay, so on the left, we've got a Muhlenbergia that exhibits an on. And if we were to look closely at the lemma, we'd see it has 3 nerves. And then on the right, we've got a Sporobolus or drop seed. This is tall drop seed. In this case, we have no on. That's one characteristic, and the lemma has one nerve. And then the other characteristic down here in the photograph, you'll see that panicle is partially enclosed in that right below the panicle. Not every Sprobolus is going to be like that, but that's one thing you can look for. Okay, and then the grommas, I've got two genera names here, Bouteloua, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, and Chondrosum. And the reason I'm showing you this is that in Hatch's book, he only uses Bouteloua. And in Shaw's book, he separates these Bouteloua into two species, two genera. So what that means is it appears that Hatch, who wrote their book in 2015, doesn't agree with Shaw, who wrote that book in 2012, as to whether the grommas should be separated out. So here's some drawings from Shaw's book. On the left, we've got Cytos gromma, which is, I think all of you know, is a state grass of Texas. The grommas or the Boutelouas are pretty easy to identify because they have this primary unilateral branch coming off, and it's very similar in most of the species. So it's fairly easy to site ID this particular genus. So whether or not you want to try to break them out into the two genera or not, it's just that when you go, what I was surprised about in Shaw's book was when I didn't see things like hairy gromma, which is on the right here. I didn't see it under Bouteloua, and I thought, where did it go? And then I found out, yeah, it's in this other genus now, according to Shaw. Okay, so the chloristes, these are things like the windmill grasses. The one on the left is hooded windmill, and a primary characteristic of this genera is that you're going to have these primary unilateral branches, inflorescence branches, and with these grasses, they can be either in a whorl, or they can be digitate, or they can be clustered here, like as at the top of a comb, like they are in this hooded windmill. But they're all going to be these unilateral branches like this. And then the last genera I want to mention to you is the paspalums. And in this case, that has these unilateral primary branches. The spikelets are solitary or can be paired. They're awnless. One characteristic about this genera is that the glumes are usually absent. The first glume is usually absent. And then one thing I think is really helpful is, to me, in looking at the paspalums, is these spikelets, to me, they look like tomato seeds. And so I think that's a pretty unscientific description, but that's kind of what they look like. And so it really helps in getting to that genus, in my opinion. Okay, Megan, and I think I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much. That was awesome. I love hearing about how we can put them in at least the major genre. That will really help. So our next presentation is actually by myself. It's kind of the reason we put together this grass training or party. We are looking at a new book we have finally released in 2020. So I feel like 2020 has enough bad going on that we need to focus on something that's worthy of having a party. And we're pretty excited and proud of this book that just came out. It's a field guide, so it's meant to be used in the field of all the blue stems in Texas. And I can tell you that I am not amazing at identifying grasses, and blue stems is one of those groups that is very difficult for me because there's so many different species and very closely in the way that they look. The authors on this book were myself, Dr. Suzanne Walsh, Dr. Larry Redmond, you will be hearing from, and Dr. Bob Shaw, who wrote the Grasses in Texas book that you saw earlier. Our editor was Diane Bowen, and our designer was Kelsey Sigmund. And partial funding for this book came from Reversing the Quail Decline in Texas. So I'd like to point out that there's 27 species of bluestem in Texas, and a lot of times I hear people say bluestems are good or bluestems are bad, and in reality they can't be either of those things, because some are good and some may be bad depending on your situation. There's 21 native species and only 6 introduced species that we have in the state. And it's interesting that these bluestems, and this might be part of the reason that they're very difficult to tell apart, is that they fall into 4 different genera. We have Andropogon, Bothriocloa, Dicanthemum, and Schizocerium. What's really cool is in the book they identified each grass species by either an N for native or an I for introduced. So it's very clear what species or what type of species you're looking at. You might be thinking, where did they come up with 27 bluestems? I've never even heard of that many being in our area. But really, the ones in orange, those are the 6 that were introduced. And there's some, such as the Merrill's bluestem right here, that literally the only photo we could find of Merrill's bluestem is this mount of the grass. And so there's very few of these species in the state. In fact, if you found one in one of these counties, more than likely, that would be a miracle, and you need to call a taxonomist. Don't touch the plant, call a taxonomist and let them come see it, because that would be a very special thing to actually discover. What's really cool about the book is each of these 27 species have their own individual pages where, of course, it tells their common and other common names and then their scientific name, but it goes into a lot of detail where we broke it down by height, growth habit, stems, the stem joints are those nodes. We tried to use as plain English as possible, and we found that when we were looking between resources, everybody disagreed, just like Dr. Lyons was talking about. Very difficult to get everybody on the same page in the plant world. I don't know if this happens in other worlds, but most definitely the plant world can get very confusing when they're introduced species like Angleton. If they have ecotypes, then we have the ecotypes listed out here. Like Angleton is actually what we often hear of as Gordo or Medio, that's planted for forage. And then we rounded this out with some uses and management, like for livestock, wildlife, landscaping, and then control options if there are some available. And then we tried to put in similar bluestems that you might get tripped up with, that they might look alike. And then we included as many good pictures as possible that we could get. These numbers correspond to the copyright or who took the picture, and that's all in the back of the book. Every plant has a sketch, which can be very helpful for seeing individual plant parts like Dr. Lyons was demonstrating earlier. These all came out of Shaw's huge grass book. And then we took the distribution maps from both Shaw's grass book and the grasses distribution book and tried to match those up to get a really known places. Now, don't call me and gripe at me because your county's not highlighted and you know that plant is there. Definitely let me know so we can update that on a future version. But we know for a fact that if the 2 counties nearby have the plant, then more than likely the county in between does as well. It just hasn't been documented there yet, and that's why you don't see it on the page. So we also put in a grass sketch, but we made it very simple because when you're standing in a field, that is not a good time to start learning a bunch of grass parts. So we used as plain names as possible, such as basal leaves all coming from the base, or if they have cauline leaves that also originate up the stem, like this one in the picture. We have seed heads with no branches, with branches, or ones that have branches coming off of what's called a rachis, or that we called it the seed head stem, so that you can actually identify the difference between those seed heads. So this is the only reference to the grass parts in the book, and they're the only grass parts that you need to know in order to use this book. What I also like is that we included a how to use this guide. So this is me right here to avoid aimlessly flipping through all the plants because that is not a good way to go, because you know that can get quite daunting when you get a new book and you're not sure how to use it. So we actually put a seed head key, which we'll look at in just a second. But before we move on, I wanted to point out that we put all of the measurements in this book in English, so they're not in metric. You'll see inches, not centimeters. Very easy. You and your friend don't even have to fight over who has 1-inch finger joints. I know it's a big controversy. Instead of using your finger, you could actually flip the book over, and there is a ruler on the back of the book, which is 9 inches tall itself, to help you measure those parts while you're in the field. So here's that seed head comparison. We went through a lot of trials on how it would be best to lay these plants out and if we needed a key. And what we came to is that a lot of times with these grasses, it's really important to have a seed head in order to help identify that. So we tried to group seed heads by the ones that may appear to look alike, especially to people who aren't ultra familiar with the bluestems that they have in their county. The only one that's by itself is silky bluestem, and I'll show you why in just a little bit. Has very long awns, fuzzy, dense white hairs. That one really doesn't look like the other bluestems. And then along with these seed heads, we put whether it was a common species with all 3 dots blackened, a limited species with only 2 of the dots blackened, which means it's only found in certain parts of Texas, or a very rare species that you're unlikely to see with only 1 dot blackened. So here's the example. So all of these we would consider kind of fluffy seed heads. In some way or another, bushy and little are the ones that are the most common. So if you thought it might be one of these, you can go directly to the page, which is listed here in the seed head comparison chart. And again, these numbers are just referencing who that picture belongs to, or who the credit belongs to. And then these that are limited in their region, so they're in certain parts of Texas, are broom sedge, seacoast, splitbeard. And then if you find crimson elliot or honey, that would be a rare occurrence. And so not that you won't come across these, but that's a little bit more rare than the other ones. Here's the one where we saw the branching on those seed heads, sort of like Dr. Lyons was referencing earlier. The more common ones across the state are big bluestem and King Ranch bluestem, but you'll also find in limited areas Angleton bluestem, Kleberg, sand, and then rarely Australian pitted and Wrights. Here's silky bluestem. I know I blew that up so that that's a little bit blurry looking, but silky bluestem is, I hate to say it, kind of a pretty grass because it's an introduced grass, but this one most definitely occurs in certain regions. It's limited, but does occur, and it's a very distinct looking grass. When you see it, you know it. Slender in Texas are a little bit more plain, not quite fluffy like the other ones. Slender's a little bit more common than Texas would be, but it just depends on where you are in the state. And then here's our fluffy branching seed heads. These more common ones are cane and silver. And then the less common, the more limited in area would be hybrid, long spike silver, Springfield. And then rarely you'll see awnless merrills or tall, but all contenders that sort of look alike until you really start digging into it. So next, I would encourage you to check either the range maps on these individual pages or the list of bluestems by county that's in the back of the book to see which bluestems are likely to be in your area or in the areas that are right around you. So that'd be a good place to start. And now you should have that narrowed down to only a few plants to consider. So in the back of the book, you'll see that there's a bluestems by county key, and each one of these 27 plants has a key. For instance, AN for Angleton, PT for pitted, and then there's actually 4 pages of these counties because we have so many in Texas that have listed out all of those plants that are known to occur in the county just to get you started. So you do want to look at surrounding counties, but this is a good place to start instead of aimlessly flipping through the book trying to find a bluestem that looks like the one you have. Also, we went ahead and made a page where it broke it down by bluestem distribution. So this is really these 6 plants. Those are the common or the widespread bluestems across the entire state. These are also common in certain areas, but not across the entire state. And then this is our list of uncommon or rare bluestems. So you could see if you were interested in studying and learning the bluestem groups or the 4 genera that are included with bluestems, you could start with these common ones and then work on the limited ones that are occurring in your region and then go to the rare. So it's not quite as daunting as thinking about learning 27 bluestems. We also included a glossary of any term that we use that might be confusing in the book, and then we have a very plain English definition for that. So this is only a 1-page deal because we tried to be as clear and as plain as possible in our writings. If you're interested in ordering the book, I've been asked quite a bit about where to order it, but we really weren't debuting the book until today. I will copy and paste this into the chat box. Whoops. Maybe at the next break or while the next speaker's speaking, I'll put that link in the chat box, or it's in your invite in the agenda that's attached. There's a link you can click to go directly to order this. No matter whether you order it from Marketplace or the AgriLife bookstore, it's still $20. The difference will be in the shipping. The shipping's a little bit cheaper coming straight out of our office, and that's what the link is to. But you could also go to the agrilifebookstore.org, and at the search box at the top, you want to make sure that you type in Bluestem Grasses in Texas, or there is a good chance that it is not going to pop up. I want to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Dr. Larry Redmond. He's an Extension Forage Specialist and Associate Department Head for Extension in the Soil and Crop Sciences Department at Texas A&M. As you've already heard, Dr. Redmond was a co-author on the Bluestem Grasses in Texas Field Guide, responsible for providing the vast majority of the information for the 6 introduced bluestem species and their ecotypes. But don't let that fool you. Dr. Redmond also holds a master's in wildlife management, and he understands the balance between land uses for livestock and wildlife. Today, I've asked him to share with us what the most popular forage grasses in Texas are and why they are.
All right, appreciate the introduction, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we need to discuss is that the vegetational areas of Texas are dramatically different from east to west and north to south. And what grows really well, say over the piney woods of East Texas, does not necessarily mean that that grass will grow well for you in the Edwards Plateau. So before you think about maybe establishing a new grass on a piece of property, it would be good to check with somebody at one of the research and extension centers, with your county extension agent, with local NRCS or Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists, and ask them if that particular grass has a history of being successfully grown in that area. Because a lot of times without that information, we can make some poor choices and be really disappointed with the results. So there's this introduced versus native. And if you kind of went back in time to the 60s, Bermuda grass had been released, coastal Bermuda grass had been released in '43. And there was a lot of interest in this new grass because given water and fertilizer, it produced a tremendous amount of forage, and it was very resilient and tolerant of close grazing. Today, that's not necessarily the case because a lot of people have sort of looked at livestock versus wildlife, and a lot of people are more interested in wildlife. We call it recreation. That's why a lot of the property has been purchased nowadays. But if you look at the introduced forages, and we still have a tremendous amount of them, Bermuda grass probably leads the pack on that. Kleingrass is another grass that was introduced. All of these are from Africa, as you can see. Wilman and weeping lovegrass, Johnsongrass, some of the annuals such as the sorghum Sudan, Sudan grass, pearl millet, teff. And then from Asia, we have the old world bluestems, and Megan did an excellent job of describing those. She talked about 6 different varieties that have been introduced into Texas. And then from South America, we have not only the fire ant and the Africanized honeybee, but we also have Bahia grass and Dallas grass as gifts to us from South America. And then we have the native grasses. So when we talk about introduced versus native, again, the Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Dallas grass are typically grown east of the Interstate 35, Interstate 37 line. That's because we have more moisture in that part of the state. If you look at west of that line, Kleingrass, Wilman lovegrass, and the old world bluestems do very well that side of the line of Interstate 35, 37. And most of the natives, although you can find natives scattered across the state because we have set the plow to so much of our property in the eastern part of the state, we've actually destroyed a lot of those natives. So the natives today are typically found on what we refer to as the rangelands, and those are going to be found in the western part of the state. This little chart, it sort of gives you a little risk rating. If you look at the different species over there on the left, and then you look across the top at those 10 ecoregions in Texas, and you can see that if there's just one X, then it's probably marginally adapted to that area. Doesn't mean it won't grow there. We know that Bermuda grass grows throughout the Edwards Plateau, but you're really getting on the fringe area out there. But if you look at something like Bahia grass is just not going to be found in the Edwards Plateau, the rolling plains, high plains, Trans-Pecos, those ecoregions in Texas. Buffalo grass, if you look there, it's primarily found in South Texas, and that's due to cold tolerance. It can grow up to about College Station, but you'll find most of it down in South Texas. Again, Dallas grass is going to be found primarily in the eastern part of the state. Natives, again, you can find those all across the state. And the old world bluestems, I've seen them growing in the crack in the sidewalk in Tyler, Texas. And so, not to say that they won't grow in East Texas, but they don't do as well there as they would in other parts of the state. I always recommend that if you're interested in cutting hay, if Bermuda grass will grow for you, it's probably your best bet because you get a much better return on your fertilizer investment dollar with Bermuda grass than most of the other forage species. So when talking about livestock forage, any of these forage species can serve as the basis for a very successful livestock production enterprise. And I mean, you think about, say, the Trans-Pecos, where it's extremely dry, but that's some of the best cattle country in the state of Texas if you're stocked appropriately. And that's the big thing about any of these forages. You need to understand that the stocking rate is going to be the most critical aspect of your livestock production system. A lot of places are overstocked, and we need to have a second visit about that probably, but we need to understand that any of these forages will work for us anywhere they're adapted in the state, but as long as we have the stocking rate right. Under grazing, there's little to no requirement for fertilizer for most of these species except for Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass is one of those species that it was selected for a response to fertilizer, and if you don't fertilize Bermuda grass, then over time it will thin on you. It will eventually be replaced by something else. Many times, whatever it's replaced with may be okay. Many times, though, what it's replaced with is not okay. And so, if you don't want to fertilize your Bermuda grass, you might want to think about replacing that with something else that doesn't require the amount of fertilizer that Bermuda grass does. But having said that, any crop that we cut for hay requires soil tests and fertilizer because the nutrients removed with a hay harvest are tremendous. If we're grazing, we don't hardly remove any of the nutrients from that site. Most of those nutrients are recycled back into the system. But when we're in a hay harvest situation, that's really a mining operation, and we're removing a tremendous amount of nutrients. And if we're not careful to replenish those nutrients, then we can actually ruin the production capacity of that particular piece of property. So I would say also that I don't recommend cutting natives for hay. I've heard people say that we've cut natives for hay for 40 years, but they're not the same natives that you started with. Because if you think about some of those tall grasses, they don't need to be cut any closer than 12 to 14 inches. If we're cutting them extremely low, like most of the hay operations do, then over time we'll see a change in species composition. There may still be some natives, but they won't be the natives that you started out with. I want to mention a couple of toxicity issues that we want to be aware of. Kleingrass is a cattle-only forage. If we try to feed this to horses, sheep, or goats, there's some compounds in that grass that can cause liver damage for all of those species except for cattle. Cattle do very well. In fact, cattle performance on Kleingrass is better than cattle performance on coastal Bermuda grass. But we just need to understand that if we are thinking about having a forage base for something such as horses, sheep, or goats, we probably need to avoid Kleingrass. And I know there's people that say we run our horses on Klein all the time, but the official recommendation from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension would be to stay away from Kleingrass if you have horses. The other thing is with Dallas grass, if you're over in the eastern part of the state where Dallas grass is found and frequently in the lower areas, you can have some problems with an ergot fungus that can produce these compounds that impact the nervous system. We used to say that it just caused the staggers and that death did not typically occur, but we have since found that indeed, if you're not careful, you can actually lose cattle due to that ergot fungus poisoning. Warm season annuals, I hate them because they're expensive and they kill cattle, but other than that, they're great. As long as I think you need to irrigate them because that will reduce the potential for nitrate accumulation or prussic acid poisoning. But they can provide some excellent performance for cattle, and they can provide some pretty high quantities of fairly good hay. A lot of people will tend to cut that when they're overly mature. You need to cut those plants when they're about 48 to 60 inches tall. Try to leave a leaf at the bottom and you can actually get a second harvest. But again, under droughty conditions, they can accumulate nitrates to a level that will kill your cattle when you feed that back during the winter. Sorghums can produce prussic acid while the plant's growing, not as a hay crop, but that can also be deadly. Nitrates or prussic acid both kill cattle in about 20 minutes. So you just want to be careful with that. So in summary, then, warm season perennial grasses are going to form the basis for almost any livestock operation, not only in Texas, but across the South. There's a lot of different Bermuda grass species, and they differ a lot. Tifton 85, for example, has the best animal performance of any of the Bermuda grass species, and it also has the best drought tolerance. And so if you're thinking about maybe introducing Bermuda grass to a location, then Tifton 85 might be an excellent choice. There's alternative species of Bermuda grass, and they require much less in the way of fertility inputs. Stocking rates are going to be reduced compared to well-managed Bermuda grass. That's just a given. But if you're in a situation where you're not getting the rainfall, where you can actually manage Bermuda grass like it should be managed, then there's alternatives, but the stocking rate is going to be reduced. And then again, the native forages offer many, many benefits not provided by introduced forages. And again, back to wildlife habitat, the more plant species diversity we have, that increases the potential for wildlife species diversity. And so a lot of people that are interested in recreation and wildlife have taken Bermuda grass or other introduced forages out and are replacing those with native species. Unfortunately, we can never recreate the prairie because there's a lot of those plants, 50 to 150 plants per acre, different species. We can't even get the seed for a lot of those things. But the more species you have, the better off you'll be for wildlife. And with that, I will stop, Megan, and quit my sharing and turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Redmond. That was a really good overview of our introduced species in Texas. The next talk is from me again, the Bluestems Beyond the Field. You'll see that Dr. Bob Lyons is also on this presentation, and he touched on some of this earlier, but he's really helped me to appreciate the ability to look at different bluestems that in the field we might call old world bluestem, and that name doesn't necessarily mean a lot to a lot of people, and figure out how to really put a name with it. There's particularly a lot of confusion between King Ranch bluestem, Kleberg bluestem, and Angleton bluestem. Now, if you're not in areas where all three of these occur, then that might not be the case. But for a lot of people, that definitely does happen. So does it matter? Does it matter if we actually know the difference between these plants? If you don't want these introduced bluestems on your place, then perhaps it doesn't. You're kind of in the same boat with any of them. But we might find that our management practices may need to be different with different species if we were able to tell them apart. So far, they've been largely clumped together. Also, as you heard from Dr. Redmond, people do enjoy Angleton bluestem. They plant medio and gordo bluestems, and these are for forage for livestock, and that might be a little bit more advantageous for livestock than your King Ranch or your Kleberg bluestem would be. So again, there's 6 bluestems in Texas. Right now we're focusing on this King Ranch bluestem, also called KR bluestem or sometimes yellow bluestem. It was originally released as yellowbeard, and so that might be another term that you hear. But the ecotypes can be really varied within this species. So one is the true King Ranch bluestem, but WW Spar, WW Ironmaster, Plains, and Granada are all actually tied to this original King Ranch bluestem. We're also looking at Kleberg bluestem, which people think are very closely related because they look so similar, but they're actually in different genera. And the T587 bluestem or the Pretoria 90 bluestem. And then the other one we'll be looking at, where did it go? Angleton bluestem, also called on dicanthium, and that is your gordo and medio. So where are they located? So kind of look for where you are in the state or the region that you live in, because this map might not be perfectly exact by county, but King Ranch bluestem pretty well occurs throughout the state. I know we've been conversing about it up in this area today. I'm down in this area where we have it prolifically, but we also have Kleberg bluestem, which looks very similar. We used to say that Kleberg was limited to the coast, but it has been confirmed in counties outside of the southern coastal region of Texas. And then Angleton bluestem can also occur in quite a few counties throughout the entire state. So first thing you could look at is the stolons versus rhizomes, and Dr. Rector touched on the difference between these two. A stolon is a stem that's above ground, and the way I remember that is stolon starts with an S and C. You can see the stolon because it's above the ground. And this is a definition straight out of that Bluestem Field Guide, very easy to understand. And then rhizome is a stem that originates from the base, but it's underground, grows horizontally underground. So I think of rhizome like R, rhizome, R root, because it acts more like a root because it's underneath the soil surface. So when we look at the difference between these species, King Ranch can have stolons or rhizomes, whereas Kleberg and Angleton have stolons. So if you notice that a plant has a lot of rhizomes, you're leaning more towards a King Ranch identification than a Kleberg or an Angleton. Also, we're looking at the spikelet shape, and Dr. Lyons touched on this, that King Ranch will have a sharp spikelet. You can see the point right there, and Kleberg or Angleton are blunted, so it's really more round. So here's my fear. I'm not amazing at identifying grasses, and I looked at these underneath a small hand lens to magnify that, and I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But when you look at blunted, you're thinking, is that blunted or is it sharp? But I can assure you that when you look at a King Ranch bluestem spikelet under a microscope, this looks like a pinpoint. It is very, very pointed. So if you see rounding or if it looks buffed off at the edge, then you're probably looking at a Kleberg or an Angleton bluestem. Now, how are we going to tell the Angleton and the Klebergs apart? So Kleberg has long hairs up towards the top of the spikelet, as you can see in this really good drawing that came, again, it's in our Bluestem Field Guide book, but it first came out of Shaw's Texas Grasses book. Whereas Angleton has long hairs at the bottom of the spikelet. So it kind of looks like it has an upside down wig. If you were to turn this spikelet over, that would look like a hairy wig. And this is a little bit more free. It's not quite as tight as you see these on the bottom, but you do notice that those hairs are concentrated towards the top. So these are very obvious things once you're able to get a microscope on that grass, maybe back at the office, or even if you could carry one in your truck, you could look at it on your truck console to get a good identification between Kleberg and Angleton. So just in summary, we have King Ranch bluestem with our sharp spikelets. It has stolons or rhizomes. It can have both. Kleberg bluestem has the blunted spikelet just like Angleton. They both have stolons, but with Kleberg, we're looking at kind of crazy hairs towards the top of the spikelet. With Angleton, we have more condensed hairs that are found at the bottom of the spikelet, like an upside down wig. So that's how you tell the difference between those three bluestems. So good luck with that. Let me know if you have any questions, and we're going to move on to our next speaker. So our next presentation will be on the seed selector tool for native plantings that was developed by the Texas Native Seeds. Here with us to present this tool is Dr. Tony Falk. He's the Assistant Director of South Texas Natives, specializing in habitat restoration. South Texas Natives, or the larger Texas Native Seeds Project, is a part of the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M University, Kingsville. This seed selector tool is easy to use and the only one like it in the state. So thank you very much for sharing with us about this great resource today, Dr. Falk.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully I can kind of introduce this to everybody if you hadn't already seen it, and help some folks out, as this can be very confusing at times, as it seems like dealing with grasses can in general. Thought this was kind of a neat picture to start things off from a planting we had done. Picture you can pick out probably 8 or 10 different kinds of seeds laying there on the ground. Really neat to see the variety that plants can produce. So ideally, we'd like all of our plantings to turn out like this. And we've got the late successional little bluestems and multi-flower false rhodes grass, mid-successional pappus grasses, inside oats, forbs, early successionals, the whole 9 yards. Unfortunately, as a lot of us who have dealt in native grassland restoration seedings know that that's not always the case. One thing we found for sure is that species selection is probably one of the most important factors in determining that success. It's been pointed out earlier today, things are very different from across the state. Although you have some species that will cover the whole state, like the little bluestem showing up in the top left-hand corner of that picture there. The little bluestem that, does well in, say, the coastal prairies where that picture in the top left is taken from is very different from something further up the coast, which is the picture on the upper right. The mountains of West Texas in the lower left, or the cross timbers, Blackland Prairie picture in the bottom right. And even closer to home, here's 3 pictures from South Texas, which is kind of our area of focus, or my area of focus, line from Del Rio to San Antonio to Victoria. Again, the top left picture, eastern South Texas, sand sheet there in the center, and western South Texas in the bottom corner. We're talking hundreds of different species and a number of different varieties, and to pick which ones would work the best for your planting can get awful daunting. So we developed the seed mix recommendation tool as a way to help people out that quickly need a seed mix recommendation. Example here, wanted to show a picture of, say, your landman. You got a pipeline coming through. You've been talking to your landman. We want to do natives, and you're working back and forth. And he says, hey, company says, let's go for it, but I need a seed mix in the next 30 minutes. This seed mix tool can provide you a starting place to go off of. Or working with a landowner, maybe a lot more long-term project, doing some well pad restoration or just some brush work. Somebody calls, says, hey, I need an answer and I need something right now. Well, I've got somebody else on the phone. This is the kind of place where we wanted to really develop this tool and help people out. And finally, probably one that's been a lot more on people's minds, it seems, lately. I know we've been certainly getting a lot more calls, is invasive grass conversions. There's a picture of a project we were doing earlier this year. You know, talked to a lot of land managers that say, hey, the owner came in and said they didn't like the look of this. They wanted an answer yesterday. So we had developed this native seed selection tool to be able to give somebody a seed mix for their location within 3 simple clicks. Most people who definitely are listening to this presentation or these presentations today know their grasses, they know their plants, are very capable of developing their own seed mixes. However, I wanted to throw this table up. This is the 87 commercial variety, named varieties currently on the market, marketed to Texas. As you can see, several of these species have multiple varieties. Little bluestem there in the center of your screen. I think there's 6 of them marketed for the state, similar with Cytops grama. Then we want to throw on top of that some of the species that don't necessarily have named varieties. There's another 260 plus native species marketed and sold to the state of Texas by commercial seed growers on top of the 87. So that's putting you at 350 plus different options for you to choose from for your planting. You know, if you're not really familiar with a lot of these, with the different names, some of the different species, to have to do your research and say which ones work the best for your location and your soils can get rather daunting. So we developed this native seed mix map. I've provided the link for it here. If you Google search Texas native seeds, you'll see it's kind of inside Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute's website. On the left-hand side of that, there's a menu and it'll be seed mix map. The first screen that pops up is what you see off to the right-hand side there. These different regions correspond to the kind of different regions that Texas Native Seeds operates in. So to select a seed mix, you will first click on a region that is outlined in black there. Once you click on that, you'll get a zoomed into that region. So just as an example, I chose South Texas here. As you can see, it's zoomed into that region. Once you're within that region, you'll click on a county. That county will pop up in the little pop-up box. I've zoomed in there on it to the right so you can see it better. For each ecoregion within that county, we've provided seed mixes for either sandy soils or clay soils. As you can see, not every county has, or every ecoregion has every soil. By name, kind of coastal sand plains typically only has sandy soils. Some counties have multiple ecoregions, some only have one, but we tried to include everything we could in these. And actually, I'm going to pull this up here so you can see it better. Once you click on the county and the soil, a PDF is generated so they can be easily printed, saved, emailed, whatever you'd like to do with it. On these PDFs gives a seed mix recommendation, including both grasses and forbs. We tried to keep these to between 10 and 15 different grass species. One of the other things that we did is we structured our mixes so that there is 100% of the mix in grasses and then the forbs on top. The reason we had done that is, you know, say for your project, you wanted to focus on more cattle grazing. So you didn't want to have to include the pollinators. We didn't want to have somebody try and recalculate all of the percentages on their own. We also included trying to include even mixes of early and mid to late and late successional species so we can kind of recuperate everything all at once. And then finally, you'll see that we've included the contact information for the 3 seed vendors who are carrying each species, along with the assistant director for each region and their contact information. So one of the things that I want to point out in these is these are kind of quote unquote generic mixes. They'll work very well kind of within that region, ecoregion soil type. But as always, all of our assistant directors are available if you want something more specific. If you've got time to wait, please feel free to contact any of these folks and they can give you things more specific. A lot of the species will be the same, but they may tweak percentages a little bit. We'll have a little bit more up-to-date information on what's commercially available at the time and really be able to help and answer your questions. But we wanted to be able to get something out there and on the market and available to everybody in a quick 3-click method that when they need an answer now, or maybe they're too shy to call and ask for help, there's something available that they can get to and get to quickly.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Falk. That was an awesome overview of the different seed mix tools. All right. So our final session, and I hope you've enjoyed all of these really great presentations by our speakers today, is what I call my big 4. I know we refer to the big 4 tall grasses in the original prairie of Texas, but my big 4 are 4 grasses that I have a really hard time telling apart when I see from a distance especially, and sometimes even up close. And that's switchgrass, Johnsongrass, Kleingrass, and Guinea grass. And I have Dr. Baron Rector on this presentation as well because a lot of this information came straight from him and his quest to help me figure these grasses out. And we're hoping to turn this information into more of an extension publication in the future. So the first grass I want to talk about today is switchgrass. It's the only native in my big 4. It is a good grazing grass, but it decreases with heavy grazing. So a lot of times we can tell a lot about a place if we go on to it and we see a lot of switchgrass there. We know that it's well taken care of. Consequently, really thick patches of switchgrass might not be really desirable from a lot of the wildlife standpoint, but they are bunch grasses that can be used for nesting, and the seeds could be eaten by wildlife. Johnsongrass, the next grass, is actually native to Turkey. It has spread across most of the southern U.S. It is a weed in cultivated fields, but oftentimes we see it along ditches. It's valued actually for like forage grass and for erosion control, its ability to hold the soil. It does have some toxic accumulations despite it being liked as a forage grass. It can collect cyanide in freshly frosted plants, or it collects nitrates after fertilization and during drought. So a couple of negatives: you have to be careful how you graze it, but it can be a good grazing grass. In fact, a lot of times if I get a call from somebody having trouble with Johnsongrass, they do not have livestock on their place. Number 3 is Kleingrass, which is also a good grazing grass that Dr. Rector covered earlier in our introduced forages section. Like he said, it can cause photosensitization in horses, sheep, and goats. So a lot of times people have this when they have cattle, but like he said, some people have it and get away with it with horses. The seeds could be eaten by birds, but for the most part, this is not a desirable grass if you're interested in managing for livestock, and it can be quite prolific. The next one that is the same is Guinea grass. Guinea grass is native to Africa. It has creeping rhizomes. It gets very tall. It's very difficult to get rid of. It creates sort of a fire ladder and a higher intensity of prescribed burns that may not be desirable when managing a place. It also responds quite quickly after burns. So a number of difficult characteristics of a few of these plants if you were to get them on your land. So the seed head, I think, is what initially really throws me off with these plants. We know that switchgrass, the seeds are mostly on short stalks and may have a purplish tinge. So they're in here. They can be 6 to 24 inches long. Johnsongrass, which I pulled this off of our rangeplants.tamu.edu website. It often has long awns, which you can actually see in this picture with the black background. And the seeds are much bigger than the others. It might be hard to compare on here, but they're really much bigger than the other 3 in my list. And the seed heads go about 8 to 16 inches long, depending a lot of times on what type of soils it's on. Guinea grass, the seeds are bigger than Klein, but they're equal or bigger than switchgrass. And usually the panicum or the seed head is about 1.5 to 16 inches long, so that can really vary. Kind of a difficult grass because of the variations in how it might look on different places. And then Kleingrass has the smallest seeds. The seed head's usually about 3 to 10 inches long. So these seed heads all look very similar to me, especially from a distance. And we're going to look at some other characteristics that might be a little bit more definitive that might help you place the grass with the correct name. So one might be plant height. This is my poor husband who is stuck helping me with projects such as this. Switchgrass is 3 to 8 feet tall and can be over 10 feet at times. Johnsongrass, which is pictured right here, gets up to about 6.5 feet tall at its highest, but it often is found to be shorter on drier sites. And then Guinea grass gets up to 8 feet tall, just like a switchgrass would. That's the one that I said is oftentimes a ladder fuel for prescribed fires because it'll grow up into the canopy of trees. And then Kleingrass is typically a little bit shorter, more like a Johnson grass, and it'll grow about 4.5 to 6 feet tall. So stems are a little bit varying between the species, and it could be one way even from a distance to immediately tell these species apart. Switchgrass grows straight up. It has very hollow stems, as you see in this little bit blurry picture I took with my cell phone. Johnson grass also grows straight up, and they have big stems, but they store sugars in them. If you think of Johnson grass, it's a sorghum, just like the sorghum Sudans that we plant in crop fields. At the bottom of the Johnson stem, and I wish I had a good picture here for you, it's indented even 2 to 3 inches up. You'll see a little indentation in that stem, so that's a dead giveaway that that's a Johnson grass. Guinea grass also grows straight up, but it has very thin stems, very thin stems, but they don't fall down right away. So some of them you might see at the bottom falling down, but a lot of times that's how it grows up into those canopies. It grows straight up with those very thin stems that can get very tall, as opposed to Kleingrass, which is straight or it grows at an angle. Stems might grow out at an angle. They're very weak and thin. So if you see green grass that's falling over, that you want to tell the difference between these 4, that is likely a Klein that's weak and falling over, because even in its green state, you'll find that growing back towards the ground. The leaves on these plants also differ just a little bit. The main one that pops out to me is that Johnson grass has that very definitive white midvein that's most recognizable on the back of the leaf. It also grows that endophyte fungus, which makes those red or purple blotches, kind of like circle bullet holes on the plant. The leaves are also very sharp. Switchgrass kind of has that yellow-green color, and it also tapers at the end, so that's something to look for switchgrass. Guinea grass, on the other hand, has sheath collars that have a lot of hairs. So we're talking about this place right here. You're going to see a lot of hairs on Guinea grass, and the leaves tend to weep over a little bit, just like this one is here. So not the stems necessarily growing down because they're weak, but the leaves weeping over. Also, Guinea grass is typically the shortest leaf. So it grows all up the stem, but they'll be very short. Kleingrass can be kind of a bluish color. It has flat or rolled edges, and it also has a white midvein. Did you know that? It has a white midvein, but it's only on the lower part of the leaf. And this is the coolest thing. We've done an agent training before, and everybody really loves this once you see it. You can definitively tell Kleingrass without a seed head even by the glands or the pimples on the side of the leaf. So if you look at the leaf, the bottom 1/5 of the leaf only, you're going to see little like bumps on the side, the edge of the leaf that look like pimples, and there's going to be a hair growing out of them. So if that was on somebody's face, gross, right? But on a leaf, that's cool. That's a good characteristic to know that that's Kleingrass. Of the four, what would you call this grass right here? It is switch. And one good way to tell that again is it has very large stems that grow straight up. So the height of this plant, the size of the stems, and the way that it's growing straight up all indicate that it's switch. Also, you can see it has a fairly large seed head at the top, which could get confused with some, but very small seeds, very long. All right, what about this one? Switch, Johnson, Klein, or Guinea. One dead giveaway is that endophyte fungus that grows on the leaves of the plant that makes sort of bullseyes on it. This tells us that this is Johnsongrass. What about this picture? Guinea grass. Yep, this is Guinea grass. It has leaves that might weep over, but its stems are not weeping over. Very tiny seeds. You see how they even look feathery in this picture? Tiny seeds, but a pretty long seed head in this case. But again, you see that those stems are small, but they're straight up. And then those leaves weep just a little bit. What about this one? This must be Klein. This one is Klein. I'm sorry, I don't know how I got this red splotch down there, but you can see how the stems are starting to grow to the side. They're very small. So some are standing up, of course, but some are growing out because they're weak. And also look how tapered and pointed those leaves are. That's another dead giveaway for Kleingrass. And the seeds are very small and they're very spread out. So all good things to look at. But these, if you have them all occurring in your area, can be quite a challenge to identify. If y'all would click on that link either now or as soon as we're done and fill out that survey, I would much appreciate it. We've really enjoyed putting on this training for you today. We'd like to find out how to kind of gauge our future trainings to make sure that they're beneficial for you. Bye everybody, have a great day.